this analogy that I would bet almost every one of you have a certain analogy or mental picture in your mind. And here's what he says in verse 15. Be on your guard against false prophets who come to you, what? In sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravaging wolves. I'm going to tell you probably what your mental picture is that you've learned from cartoons, pictures, and analogies over the years. Your mental picture right now is one of a wolf who's literally dressed up in a sheep suit, like a sheep costume with this little sheep head on top of the wolf. We've probably all seen them in cartoons and different pictures, and that is not what Jesus is talking about. If somebody came in a literal sheep costume, we would think it's Halloween or something, right? That's not what he's talking about here. What he is speaking of here is men who come into the assembly of right teaching and they're wearing shepherd's clothing. So what is shepherd's clothing? A shepherd, he shepherded sheep, he cared for, he nurtured, he nourished sheep, he fed them. And what was one of the fruit, if you want to call it, of sheep, or one of the byproducts of sheep? They would grow their coats, right? Their wool. And every so often, every season, or maybe a few times a season, what would they do? They would shear the sheep and they would cut that off. And then what did that wool be? What was it used for? Man, great, long-lasting, rough, kind of coarse coats. And so in that day and age, depending on your trade or your line of work, you would sometimes wear a coat or a cloak that resembled or was close to what you had. So if somebody wore a wool coat, guess what people could safely assume they were? Oh, he's a shepherd. He's wearing a wool coat, and so he is a shepherd. So here's what Jesus is saying. He's warning the people, hundreds, maybe thousands were on that hillside in this Sermon on the Mount as he's bringing it to a close. He says, be on your guard against false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, a wool coat. And people say, oh, he must be a shepherd. But what are they really? They're a ravaging wolf. How many defense mechanisms do sheep have? Absolutely zero. They have none. And many times in Scripture, we're referred to as sheep without a shepherd outside of Jesus. But a sheep is defenseless. And what is a wolf? They're close to what you may call an apex predator. Man, they will eat and devour, and that's their desire. And so here's what Jesus is saying. Be on guard for these men or women who come and they've got on a shepherd's coat. They look like a shepherd, but they're nothing more than a wolf that wants to destroy you and ravage you. And you're like, so how do I know? What does this look like and how will I know? But just know today, from today here on out, please don't look at this as a wolf in a sheep costume. This is a man who looks like a shepherd, but he's really wanting to destroy. You see, sometimes people are literally dressed up in these analogies and cartoons, but this actually shows us of those who looked the part but really didn't. They may look legit and even sometimes be respected. Some of these shepherds, let's fast forward it to today because pastors don't have to wear wool coats today, right? Sometimes they might be holding the microphone on Sunday morning. They might be popular on YouTube or social media and presence. They may be in front of large groups, maybe even followed by thousands or followed by millions. They may even use some Bible verses. They actually may know the Bible very well. But a wolf, my friends, disguises theirself as a shepherd, a description, but they're actually ravenous and ravaging. Some of you, if you're my age or maybe you've been up on history, I remember as a boy in the late 1970s, there was probably one of the worst massacres of cults in modern history, and it was called the Jonestown Massacre. This man lured, held power and sway over. He started off preaching what looked like and seemed to be a gospel message with what seemed to be Christian foundations. And within a few years, as he took emotionally hurting and scarred people and brought them under his care and he manipulated them, this man who had on a sheep's clothing, he had on a shepherd's coat, proverbially speaking, he became a ravenous wolf. And as he relocated them down to Guyana, we know it was the worst massacre, murder. I won't call it suicide, but murder in all of modern history directly through a cult. That is probably one of the worst and most obvious signs of someone who comes across as a shepherd, but really is a ravenous wolf. And while those people never expected it would end that way, they found themselves caught up in that. But I would say to you today, while maybe not all false shepherds will go to that extreme literally of the Jonestown Massacre of the 1970s, I want to warn you, my friends, because sooner or later you may move away or you may engage and connect and commit to another church, that you will learn to beware of false teachers, false prophets, and those who are true. And so he says in the next verse, he actually bookends verse 16 and verse 20. If you want to look at your text, he says, you'll recognize them by their fruit. And then at the very end in verse 20, he says, once again, you'll recognize them by their fruit. For Jesus to say something once, you need to follow it, right? But when he bookends it and he says it twice, he says you need to be discerning and understand what true fruit really is. And then he uses what we would consider of almost a redundant or a rhetorical a question you wouldn't even answer, but you must answer it. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes? And we say, yeah, absolutely not. No way. Would figs come from thistles? No way. And then Jesus says, in the same way, every good tree produces what? Good fruit. But a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree can't produce bad fruit, neither can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that doesn't produce good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So you'll recognize them by their fruit. He says every bad tree is ultimately going to be judged. When he says cut down and thrown in the fire, while that's an agriculture type kind of analogy we can all get, he means destruction. He means hell. That when those false shepherds, false teachers that are bad trees and produce bad fruit, they are going to be judged, and those who follow them will be as well. And so Jesus says you'll recognize them by their fruit. We all know that grapes don't come from thorn bushes. We all know that figs don't come from thistles. I will say this, that every once in a while, a grape might get stuck to a thorn bush, but they won't last long. And so I'd say to you today, my friends, there may be people in organizations that are actually called churches, and you may go, man, they're a true Christian, and that may be the case. But grapes don't come from thorn bushes.